Hello, everybody, and thanks again for coming. I want to take a slightly, I guess, light-hearted run through some of this. I don't have a script per se. I have tons of notes written in too small handwriting with very bad eyesight. So it's the perfect recipe for disaster that I have before me. But anyway, let me say a little bit about how I first got interested in Konstantinos Doxiadis and the Delos Symposium. I was finishing off that book that Mantha mentioned, Architect Knows Best. And I was talking to an architecture historian. He said, "What's it about?" I said, "Oh, it's about, concepts of human nature and how they inform architects' thinking. How, a place is meant to make people happier and healthier." And I got into that by looking at Le Corbusier. People criticized his cities for being antisocial. There wouldn't have been much to do in these cities, but turns out he had quite an antisocial philosophy and read lots of sort of antisocial thinking. And towards the end of his life, just a year before he died, he did this funny little sketch in his book. When he says each of us are alone in the sack of our own skins, where he's got this little sort of sausage man alone in his own skin. So when you understand that philosophy of what people are meant to be doing or what people are, the fact of antisocial cities starts to make sense. And over here we have an illustration from a slightly comical article in the American Journal of Planning from 1966 called Planners People. And the writers of that made this slightly funny comment of, when you see municipal planning schemes being sold, why do you always have a sort of cast of characters within them? And they said it suggested the values, the human values, the sort of social values of the people creating the designs. So that really interested me, and I was finishing off that book, and I was speaking to an architecture historian, modernist architecture historian, and he said, "Oh, that sounds great. You must have read Human Identity in the Urban Environment by Jacqueline Turret." And I said, "What?" "Never heard of it. What's it about?" He said, "Oh, I have no idea. I've never read it myself." So I went to read it and found out it was absolutely incredible and perfect for everything I was interested in exploring those ideas of human identity in architecture in that period. And I was infuriated that I'd never heard of it. And I spoke to people over years about this, and they'd never heard of it either. So there's this massive gap in sort of understanding of the importance of Doxiadis and the Delos Symposia, which that book in part documents. So I moved into and I started looking at Doxiadis' work, and indeed it was full of a very rich sense of how the human being, the abstract human subject, as Ahmed called him, was thought to be helped by these kinds of cities, by these kinds of architectures. Often done in sort of strange and slightly crazy ways. I've looked at this with my students, and it's very interesting the way Konstantinos Doxiadis here figures Leonardo's Vitruvian Man, which was just a sort of an analysis of the sort of ostensible physical beauty contained within human proportions, but extends it out and calculates how many meters of the distance goes the sense of sight and smell and hearing, touch and taste, mind and the soul at some uncalculable reach beyond the human being. And here you see the different qualities of human being as Konstantinos Doxiadis divides them up in this sort of highly simplifying way that Ahmed was talking about, and compares them across time. So the technocrat has this overdeveloped sort of spiky brain, compared to the man of the Middle Ages who hasn't got much mind to speak of at all. And ideally, everything in the ecumenopolis will be resolved into this perfect interlocking sphere where body, senses, mind, soul, and total man are integrated. So I found that to be really fascinating, and for me, sort of almost bordering on the edge of sort of science fiction in some kind of senses. So I was really intrigued by this. And what I then decided to do, and what I'm going to begin to do in this brief presentation, is to begin to map out how those kinds of concepts run through the Delos Symposia itself. And at the Delos Symposia, this is why I slightly disagree with Ahmed's presentation of it as being the creation of an audience for Konstantinos Doxiadis and Doxiadis' associates. In our previous workshop, Dimitri Philippidis said, of course, this was in part an attempt to try to find buyers for the Doxiadis associates' vision. Make no mistake about that. And all this whining and dining of international big shots was a sort of seduction in a way, yeah, a really sort of high-profile sales pitch in a sense. But I think it was clearly much more than that. And the guests on this, on these jollies, didn't, let's say, absolutely behave themselves completely. They didn't toe the party line at all. And it's been written in the work of Ellen Shoshkas, who gave a very fascinating talk in our first workshop and is a specialist in Jacqueline Tirett. It's been written in the work of Panayota as well, that Jacqueline Tirett, who was the editor of Acoustics, tried to maintain a real tight ship, if you like, and to control the message that was going out. She was the sole person recording what was going on, and she had the final say over the message that was finally sent out. But if she did, she didn't hold it down very, very tightly, because you can really see that there are lots of contrary viewpoints happening here. And indeed, I think Konstantinos Doxiadis himself encouraged this to a degree. In one of the texts, in one of the official documents, he asks people to stop being so serious and to drink some more in order to encourage more informal viewpoints to come through. So what I've done for this talk is just to sort of map out through this sort of strange and conflicting community of ideas, the kinds of views that, the kinds of things that they were talking about in terms of the human factor, as I call it from the title of my talk. And the human factor was a phrase that was used by a journalist called James Clayton, who was invited to the first Delos Symposium. They invited a bunch of journalists to the first Delos Symposium to report on it. They didn't appear to do that with the subsequent ones, but they got these journalists on board. And James Clayton used that phrase in his article for the Washington Post, and he said it was really interesting how so many of the people were talking about this human factor, how these momentous changes that were happening to the built environment and the changes that these speakers wanted to, these improvements that they wanted to bring to the built environment were going to make human beings happier, we're going to save them. Now, so what I've done is try to map that discourse across the first 7 Delos Symposia, the ones in the 1960s. And sometimes this is an undercurrent, and sometimes it comes to dominate the discussions. Okay? And I just wanted to start with that image there. I love this image. It was the cover of Delos 5, as you can see, October 1967. Margaret Mead and Buckminster Fuller sitting together, these two real intellectual heavyweights. They just look like your grandfather and grandmother sitting there, but they were a real big deal at the time. The pioneering ethnologist and Buckminster Fuller, I don't really know what he was. It's kind of impossible to describe what he really was, a sort of poet, visionary, inventor. But, you know, they were some of the sort of sparring partners in terms of the views of human nature that they harbored. Okay, so I'm going to run through some of those positions then. And I've tried to characterize them slightly pithily in terms of the debates that were being had there. Let's think of the very first Delos meeting then. The first Delos meeting was in 1963. And I'm looking at the official reports that were published primarily. And it's very difficult to work out who's saying what, because many of these reports are anonymized. This was Tirrett's way of, I guess, trying to suggest that there was a coherent vision. You got 20 or 30 people involved in those reports, and they're far from coherent. You can, in time, begin to intuit the voices of who's speaking where. In the first report, where Delos introduces itself, or Doxiadis and Terra try to introduce the achistic's vision to the world, we have these remarks. We must listen to the voice of every man. We must listen or concentrate on the lives of men. So there's already a distinction between a concept of man as a constant and men as a plurality of divergent differences. Inevitably, most of these discussions are heavily gendered towards man. It's man, man, man all the way through, until we get one angry intervention later on by Margaret Mead, I'm sure, who says there's enough of the man already. Okay? But here's some of the key discussions that were had in that first one. Obviously, you had Marshall McLuhan, and Marshall McLuhan, as Mark Wigley has talked about in his important essay, Network Fever, Marshall McLuhan was all about talking about the upgrading, the potential upgrading of man. That was his phrase. We must exploit this opportunity to upgrade man through the emerging telecommunications and cybernetic networks that are just coming onto the scene. So for McLuhan, this was a real opportunity to move away from the notion of a sort of stable human being. We are going to become new kinds of things, new kinds of cyborgs in a way. Over against that, you had other people presenting. A.K. Brohi, as was mentioned earlier by Ahmed, a lawyer of the Supreme Court in Pakistan, who strangely had an interesting intervention to make here. He said, we must have an ideal and stable, constant view of what human nature is. This is how doctors work, that you seek to restore someone to a state of health. So it's not about an endless trajectory of change over time. This was confirmed by Konstantinos Doxiadis himself at this time, saying, there are certain core values in human nature that we need to preserve. And Siegfried Giedion said much the same thing as well. Siegfried Giedion was, as you see down there, was one of the founders of SIAM, and he was invited to the first meeting in order to make that link between the Athens Charter, or the Athens Charters. There were two versions of it published, one by Le Corbusier and one by José Luis Sert, and the attempt by the Delos network to claim that remit for themselves. And Siegfried Giedion said that, you need to, speaking to Doxiadis and the rest of them, you need to imagine a certain vision of man, a certain lifestyle, a certain way of life that you want to aim for. You need to get away from all these damn statistics, he said. You'll make the same mistake as we made with machines. We are obsessed by machines, you're obsessed by statistics. You need to imagine a viewpoint of the kind of person you are aiming for, even if it's only an imaginary one. So you already had that conflict in this first symposium between people saying that there is a stable core of human being, and others, led by Marshall McLuhan in this instance, that there's infinite potential for human beings to be remade in the future through technology. Delos 2 was dominated by, this discussion in Delos 2, to move on, it seems to me was dominated by the great Buckminster Fuller. But there were other interesting people involved here as well. Jean Gottman, the first theorist of megalopolis, essentially said that we are at the cusp of, humankind is at the cusp of mutating into a new species, a new nomadic species, one which will change endlessly. And there was a call in this session for a new research program to assist the Delos adventure. And there were 12 areas that were identified as in need of urgent research, and 5 of those areas focused on human nature and human psychology, okay? And human experience. They included how people behaved in interiors, how they moved about spaces, how they dealt with machines, differences in different societies and tribes, and how they might change into the future. So almost half, a little under half of their key research, future research agenda was all to do with the human being. But it was Buckminster Fuller that really dominated this area of the debate in Delos too. He made an initial impression. It's quite interesting to read the reports because he comes across as sometimes a little bit as a sort of comedy figure within Delos. They seem to really enjoy him. He can always be relied upon to say something crazy. And he started straight away in his main address there by saying our communications technology without a space will imminently prove the existence of aliens, and beyond that, that they will confirm that the human species comes through them mating with monkeys. So he already has this vision of human nature that he brings to it. He's talking in this talk about his essentially fawn order geodesic domes, which will be brought in by helicopters. He's talking about these floating cloud spheres that he's interested in. But he's also talking about the future trajectory of the human being. Medicine will lead us to become deathless, he says. We'll become interfaced by machines. We'll be deathless androids. We'll continually change. We'll become a part of what he called universal architecture. He didn't distinguish between architecture as physical things and the interior architecture of the human mind or the architecture of thinking and thought, but universal architecture is the interface between all of these things until we are networked into an ever-changing environment. So he really pushed that idea that Marshall McLuhan introduced in the first Delos. At the same time that he said all of this change will ultimately help to keep us the same. It will allow us to become eternal children and to be free and creative and curious as children are at the age of 4. And it's quite interesting that his own daughter died just before the age of 4. And he continually referred back to this as a formative moment of his own sort of adventure to try to solve the problems of the planet. So that sort of characterized the second one. The third one was quite interesting, Delos 3 in 1965, because there we see the eruption of an example of really classic utopian thinking characterized there in a negative sense by Karl Popper. And it came from someone I wouldn't have expected. And it came through a debate between the ethnographer, anthropologist Margaret Mead, and Lester Granger. And Lester Granger was a very interesting guy. He was the head of the National Urban League, and he was also a professor of sociology. Sorry, just let me catch up with my notes here. But Granger outlined this vision of the person as well, which was hotly debated here. He said that essentially people and that people can only truly be energized and realized through engagement with great and challenging cities. That this was a sign of intelligence, that it required intelligence, and that it generated more intelligence. However, the cities tended to contain 3 types of people: the intelligentsia, the predators, and the thick people, as he called them, the uncivilized people, the third class. Very reminiscent of the characterization of the 3-part hierarchy in Plato's Republic between the guardians, the unruly soldiers, and literally the third class, as he called them there. And Granger says, we need to use the city in order to civilize people into this, whether they like it or not. And Margaret Mead argued back against that with a relativistic viewpoint, saying that no, on the basis of our own research into tribal societies, that we must tolerate differences. We must tolerate different tastes, different cultures, different races, ethnicities, beliefs, and so on. So that characterized the key part of the sort of human factor debate in the third one as I read through it in this sort of whistle-stop tour here. Okay, and another important part of this, as has been alluded to already in Panayot's presentation and in Ahmed's presentation, was the one that people often don't realize when you look at this image of Ecumenopolis, and that is Konstantinos Doxiadis' view and Jacqueline Tirrett's view that, yes, you have this global network, which looks like a fantastic future science fiction vision, but at the level that you would experience that, you would experience it at a very small scale. So you would experience it in terms of what Konstantinos Doxiadis called, beg your pardon, let me find it here, the arrangement of the old Greek polis, a 7 to 10 minute walk from periphery to center using local vernacular construction techniques and so on. So within this global network, you would have an intimate experience of your locale on foot. And again, as Panayota said, and Ahmed said, some of that stuff would be buried beneath the surface of the planet. So your immediate experience of it would be very sensual and very intimate and very traditionalist in a way. Okay. Delos 4 is a really interesting one for this kind of a debate. Because what happened in Delos 4 is that there's really an eruption in discussions of the human factor, so much so that the whole thing collapses. And they suggest that we have to reset the whole Delos adventure. Okay. Now, obviously, these are not the key debates throughout these presentations, throughout these workshops. They have different themes, and the core theme of Delos 4 was transport and telecommunications, infrastructure, and planning bureaucracy. But these human factor aspects come through very strongly as well. Okay. One of the things that came through thematically in the previous Delos sessions was whether human beings change or should change, or whether they are stable and should be stable. And one of the quotations from the reports here is this: "We do not yet know how..." Go away. "We do not yet know how the man..." Excuse me, just give me a moment. I told you about my notes, didn't I? "We do not yet know the measure of stability essential to human being, and how this will be combined with the mobility and flux experienced throughout reality." So stability and change, we don't know how to measure those things two against each other. And this is where we begin to see extensive use of the word anthropics, or the science of man. And at a couple of points in the reports of Delos 4, we see an almost identical statement. The science of man, anthropics, must inevitably lead to a structure, to buildings, in other words, they're talking about, to a physical structure, to buildings and cities. But we must first determine this before we find its physical structure. Okay? The science of man will inevitably lead to a structure, but we must determine this science of man before we do the physical structure. So we first have to work out what the human being is before we presume to build for the human being. This is figured slightly differently in words. Although these are anonymized, this report, this phrase is clearly from Konstantinos Doxiadis, I think. "Where is the science of man, anthropics? We have professions that each represent parts of him, psychology and medicine. But until he is fully represented and understood, how can we build his shells?" Okay, so until we understand humans, how can we build their shells, which was the word they use for buildings. So the debate was held extensively throughout throughout Delos 4. One of the things that came through quite strongly was a model of social development, which appeared to owe a lot to the work of Georg Simmel, I think. And Simmel's dynamic model of social involvement was one that lent itself very nicely to spatial analysis as well. Because for Simmel, one becomes socialized as one transgresses increasingly larger social boundaries, overlapping social boundaries. So you test yourself against more and more people, essentially. So it begins with a family, and then school, and then, I don't know, high school, university, and so on. Through these overlapping spheres, you develop a richer sense of your own identity as you compare yourself with other people. And this is figured spatially and socially by Georg Simmel, and he's amenable to a lot of these kinds of discussions. And that model, that concept of a trajectory of human social spatial development comes through in a lot of the discussions in this one. But even so, it ends in, this Delos conference ends in a kind of a stalemate, a disagreement, and an argument that we need to reset. And I'll just recall that quotation I gave you a moment ago. Until man is fully represented and understood, we won't be able to build his shells. Okay? So there's a call here, and it ends with a call by the British historian Arnold Toynbee, who's one of the many sort of peculiar figures that you see popping up here, who says that, the key future priority, research priority of the Delos Symposium will be twofold. One will be understanding what human beings are, essentially, and the other will be thinking about working in developing countries. We now have the power to move mountains, Toynbee said, but not our own stubborn wills and hearts. And that ends the conference, that ends that Delos conference. We can move things physically, but we can't understand what really makes us tick. So in 4 symposia in, they're essentially saying, let's stop and reset and try to understand what human beings are. So what do you think they did next? They completely evaded the question and dodged it. The next symposium, I'll just run through a couple more after this, and then I'll leave you in peace. But in the next symposium, they focused very much on practical implementation and forgot, in large part, the whole philosophy, the whole human factor. They were thinking about the implementation and building, or the rolling out of acoustics theory and practice across developing worlds, in particular Latin America and Africa. So you had speakers like FKA Giage there, who was a managing director of a development corporation in Ghana, Felipe Herrera, president of the Inter-American Development Bank. So the sort of human nature discussions were surprisingly absent from that one, as they focused entirely on development and went back against what they said in the previous one, which is where they said we have to work out what people are first before we presume to develop. But there were a few interesting interventions. You have this typically sort of Delos approach to sort of what a human being is there, where human beings are categorized as explained in terms of an equation, the spice equation here. Well, I don't know who's responsible for that. I think it's a guy called Reginald Lurie they began to bring psychiatrists and psychologists on board at this time, and he was a child psychologist, and it sort of smells of his thinking a little bit. But really, there was another very interesting intervention into this conference, which I think came from the tone of it. Again, these are anonymized. From the tone of it, it feels like it comes from Margaret Mead, because she's always getting angry in these events. And this is this quotation. I'll just read this to you in full, if I may. We have assumed that man is a constant and that physical variables are dynamic. But man is living in the midst of change, and he is himself a rapidly changing creature. But who is going to make decisions about what kind of people we should develop? We know that personalities can be adjusted. Who sets the criteria as to what they are adjusted to? And this is the first time, as far as I can tell, that anybody raises the ethics of seeking to manipulate behavior. Who is going to make decisions about what kind of people we should develop? Who sets the criteria as to what they are adjusted to? And that comes in part in relation to a part of a discussion where we have someone else who, again, I think it's Reginald Lurie, who is saying, we can do anything with behavioral science nowadays. It's just a matter of knowing where to stick the needle. That's the phrase he uses, to get the right kind of response. We know exactly where to stick the needle, and we can get people to do what we want. Okay? So, but someone here, and I think it's Margaret Mead, is saying, who decides what response? What is the ethics of that? After mostly dodging it for one session, it comes back hardcore in Delos 6, which is dedicated to man and his settlements. And you can even see they figured man right in the middle of this sort of swirling maelstrom right on the cover there. And this one is a real, essentially a sort of orgy of contradictory opinions about what human beings are, what they need, and what needs to be done in order to make them better. And I won't run through all of those for you because there are simply too many, but you do have Konstantinos Doxiadis and Arnold Toynbee arguing on one side that there are core values, that there are traditional conservative elements that one needs to hold on to and that mustn't be changed, over against the usual figures like Buckminster Fuller saying, no, to hell with that, we need to go into outer space, we need to sort of network ourselves into new kinds of human species. But there's no conclusion. Again, Suzanne Keller, the American professor of sociology at Princeton University, said, I quote, the discussion has oscillated between, her words, biological, psychiatric, and sociological modes of analysis, without resolution, without any satisfactory modus vivendi. All this discussion of the human being in the abstract, she says, obscures rather than clarifies. So she says we've got too much interdisciplinarity here, no one joining up, everyone's stuck in their own little silos, and we don't have a satisfactory concept of what human beings are before going on to offer her own as the definitive one. And again, it ends, interestingly, with Arnold Toynbee again, saying that human nature refuses categorization, regimentation, to use his words. It's self-contradictory. Sometimes we want freedom and isolation. Sometimes we want to be part of a group. We want to be involved. Sometimes we want disorder. Sometimes we want order. So it ends in this highly unresolved way. That if this was the attempt to answer that science of anthropics, Delos 6 fails in disarray, essentially. And the last one I want to mention is Delos 7, the last one in 1969. Not the last one. Obviously, it's the last one. It's the only one in 1969. It's the last one of the 1960s. The environmental crisis caused by overcrowding and environmental sort of spoilage was presented in this iteration of Delos at its most extreme and shrill and cataclysmic. It really is sort of this is the 11th hour before the world explodes, essentially. There's a sense of frustration here. A few months before they met, the Americans had landed on the moon, and there's some frustration that all this extraordinary technology can be used to get people to the moon, but not used for the benefits of humanity, as they put it. The discussions in this Delos are particularly extraordinary, because here we see, I think, the influence of psychologists, psychiatrists, really coming to the fore. Dr. Lambo, as you see there, again, Dr. Lurie, two prominent psychiatrists and pediatric psychiatrists. And they argue that they are arguing that we need to make constructive interventions in the development of children. We need to work hard to decontaminate the gene pool, reduce the propagation, I'm quoting here, of demonstrably delirious genes in the population. Okay, so we'll eliminate the genetically undesirable. In order to ensure our children are raised properly, we will have state-led child rearing regimes, take them out of the family unit. Another priority might be, I'm quoting again, that society must see to it that only optimally functional individuals populate its cities. Okay? It's all highly reminiscent of even those elements within Plato's Republic that Socrates himself was embarrassed to present, where he's talking about breeding a real pedigree herd, selective breeding, and eliminating defective offspring, to use his words. Defective offspring will be quietly and secretly disposed of, he said. So it takes a strangely sort of hardline Platonic turn amongst some of the people frustrated, I think, at the lack of resolution at Delos 6. Okay. So anyway, I just wanted to run through those for you, because I don't think there is a sort of an abstract human subject here. This is a horrible slide. You never want to put too much text on a slide. But here are some of the concepts of human being, of the human factor, that ran throughout and were debated across Delos. That the human nature is constant, universal, that it's variable, that we're becoming dehumanized, that we are evolving, technologically evolving, that we are changing and constant, that the main thing is the process of development, or indeed that we are monkeys crossed with aliens, as Buckminster Fuller argued. Very briefly, this will take just a couple of minutes, and I hope you find it amusing. What is the legacy of Delos then? I've been thinking about why Delos seems to have been quite forgotten, and I think some of the things that they did were out of step with the times. The absolute faith in science and technology and the expert, the belief in taking massive interventions, global interventions, were rather out of step with the 1960s, where there's a distrust of the architect planner, distrust of science, and a belief in small-scale interventions and listening to communities. So when the whole field is expanded of the architect, the ecostician's work goes from man to the planet, that really is going against what became the dominant orthodoxies of architectural thinking in the 60s. But I do think that the willingness to think hard about the people you are meant to be serving and to think philosophically about the human factor really sets Delos apart as something remarkable. And you don't see debates of this kind happening in this depth anywhere since, practically. I'm presenting this to you here in a slightly tongue-in-cheek way. Well-being. It seems to me that human nature is kind of implicated or suggested in contemporary well-being discussions. But this is a report produced by People and Places, Design of the Built Environment and Behavior. And well-being seems to be the extent of discussions of the human factor nowadays. But well-being is, in my encounters with it, is about what can we do in order to keep people optimally productive in the workplace, yeah? In order to make sure they don't take too many sick days, in order to make sure they don't have an impact on the national health system. It doesn't engage with the deeper philosophical issues of what human beings are, what they need, or whether we should be intervening with them. Okay, interiors and productivity, make sure, BRE, make sure you get return on your investment in your office interiors. And I put this one up because this is kind of funny. This is published in 2017. It was done by the All-Party Parliamentary Design Innovation Group of the UK Government Policy Connect, published 2017. Believe it or not, I was invited to be a consultant on this, okay? And I went there and I asked the question of, seeing as this was run by a conservative baroness, there was a very strong vested interest into making space syntax the solution of it. So there's a commercial aspect. I said, who decides and what are the desirable behaviors? Very reminiscent of what I think Margaret Mead was saying in Delos 4. Although I hadn't read that at the time. Who decides? Who gets to decide on what people should be doing? And they thanked me for my contribution, and they sent the draft through. And then when they published the final thing, I was gone. This is where I was consulted, but notice I was taken out of the history in the Stalinistic purge there. So those kind of questions were never asked. I was never there. And the thing that's remarkable about that is that that would never have happened at Delos. No matter how much Turret wanted to keep a control of the message, they allowed divergent points to come into view and divergent questions to be asked. And I think that sort of depth of analysis and that generosity of analysis and discussion is what is absent from this aspect of the architectural discourse nowadays. Okay, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.